In my 40 years on the bench, I've seen people walk into my courtroom thinking they can buy their way out of trouble, talk their way out of trouble, or intimidate their way out of trouble. But this case was different because the confidence wasn't coming from innocence. It was coming from entitlement. A woman looked me in the eye and basically told me the rules didn't apply to her because of who she was married to. And I remember thinking, this is going to be a teaching moment, not just for her, for everyone watching. When this case landed on my desk, it came in like many do. Paperwork, a brief summary, a charge that looked straightforward. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, alleged. And an assault charge that made me sit up a little straighter when I read the description. The defendant was a woman in her 30s, well-dressed, well-known in certain circles. The file said she was the wife of a local CEO, not a celebrity, not a politician, nothing that should matter in a courtroom. But I've been doing this long enough to know what happens when someone is used to walking into restaurants without a reservation, or calling someone and having a problem handled. The alleged victim wasn't a rival. It wasn't another socialite. It was an older man, late 60s, working a job that doesn't get the respect it deserves. A parking attendant who'd been doing that work for years, quietly, reliably, without fuss. What concerned me most wasn't just the alleged shove or slap. It was the pattern in the report, the statements about how she spoke to people, how quickly the situation escalated, how she treated basic rules like they were personal insults. My responsibility as a judge is to be fair, but fairness starts with facts. So before court, I did what I always do. I read everything. I looked at the statements. I checked what evidence the state said it had, and I prepared myself to meet the person behind the file. Here's what happened that night, as I understood it from the reports and the testimony that would later come into my courtroom. It was a weeknight, early evening, still busy downtown. There was an event going on at a nearby venue, and the streets were packed. The parking lot in question had clear signage, permit holders only. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't confusing. Big letters, bright paint, the kind of sign people ignore only when they've decided rules are for other people. According to witnesses, the defendant drove in anyway and parked in a space reserved for staff. The attendant, Mr. Russo, approached, and what struck me when I read his statement wasn't anger. It was professionalism. He didn't say he yelled. He didn't say he cursed. He said he informed her politely that the space was reserved and she needed to move her car. Now, I've watched people react to small correction in two very different ways. Some people say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know." And some people hear it as an insult to their identity, like the world is accusing them of being ordinary. Mr. Russo said she immediately became hostile. He said she responded, "Do you know who I am?" That line has been said in courtrooms since the beginning of time, and it never ages well. He told her again, calmly, that she had to move. And that's when, according to his statement, she stepped toward him, got close to his face, and said something like, "I don't move for people like you. Let me tell you something. The way you treat someone who can't do anything for you, that's who you really are." Mr. Russo said he pointed to the sign. He said she brushed his hand away. He said he took a step back and told her he'd have to call for a tow if she refused. And this is where it gets worse. According to multiple witnesses, she shoved him first, hard enough that he stumbled. Then when he put up his hands, open hands, not fists, she slapped him across the side of the face. Not a tap, a slap, a public, humiliating slap like he was a servant who'd spoken out of turn. At his age, your balance isn't what it was at 25. A shove and a slap can mean a fall, and a fall can mean broken bones, or worse. The police were called. When officers arrived, the report said she continued yelling, continued refusing instructions, and pulled her arm away when an officer tried to detain her. Now, people can have a bad day. People can lose their temper. But the law isn't designed for your best day. It's designed for your worst day, so when you lose control, other people don't get hurt. That was the story on paper. But paper doesn't show attitude. It doesn't show tone, and tone matters. So I waited to see her in person. As I continued reviewing the evidence, more details came in that made me take the case seriously. The medical report wasn't dramatic, but it was real, redness and swelling on Mr. Russo's cheek, soreness in his jaw, and wrist pain from catching himself when he stumbled. At 69 years old, even minor injuries can linger. They can affect sleep, work, confidence, everything. 7 witness statements were summarized. And what stood out to me wasn't that they were identical, it's that they were consistent in the ways that matter. Different people, different angles, but the same themes. She was the aggressor. He was trying to do his job. She acted like the rules were beneath her. There was also mention of video footage from a nearby storefront camera and a phone recording from a bystander. That told me 2 things. 1, the state wasn't relying on hearsay. 2, the public had already started doing what the public does, recording and reacting. The aftermath in the reports painted a picture of someone who didn't just make a mistake, but doubled down on it, refusing to cooperate, threatening complaints, mentioning lawyers, mentioning connections. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone starts talking about who they know, they're already admitting they don't have the facts on their side. What struck me most was that Mr. Russo didn't ask for revenge. He asked for dignity. He wanted to be treated like a human being doing honest work. Came that my courtroom gave him that dignity. By the time this case came to my courtroom, it had already taken on a life outside the courthouse. My clerk mentioned that a clip, part of the bystander video, was spreading online. People were commenting. Some were furious. Some were making jokes. And some, unfortunately, were treating it like entertainment. Let me tell you something about social media. It can turn a human moment into a spectacle in about 30 seconds. And once it does, the loudest voices start deciding what should happen without ever reading the full file. But I've always told my staff, and I'll tell you now, public attention doesn't change my approach. It doesn't matter if 8 people saw it or 8 million. In my courtroom, everyone gets the same fair process, and that includes the defendant, because justice isn't a performance, it's a responsibility. I don't sentence people to satisfy a comment section. I sentence people based on facts, law, and what I believe can guide them back toward being better. Sometimes that requires mercy. Sometimes that requires structure. And sometimes it requires a firm line that someone has never had drawn for them before. I walked into court that day, aware of the noise outside. But once I sat down on that bench, there was only one thing that mattered: what was true and what was right. When she walked into my courtroom, I noticed her before she even reached the defense table. She was dressed like she was going to a meeting, not court. Perfect hair, expensive handbag, posture that said she expected the room to adjust to her. Some defendants walk in nervous, some walk in ashamed. She walked in irritated, like the inconvenience was the real injustice. The courtroom was fuller than usual, not packed wall to wall, but fuller. A few local reporters, a few older gentlemen who looked like regulars, people who come to court because they believe in watching the system work. And Mr. Russo sat quietly near the front, wearing a simple jacket, looking like a man who didn't want attention but needed to be there. I looked at him and nodded. Not a grand gesture, just acknowledgement. Sometimes that's enough to tell someone, "I see you." I called the case and I looked directly at her. I said, "Good morning, ma'am. Please state your name for the record." She responded, "Danielle Hart." I said, "Ms. Hart, you're charged with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and simple assault. Do you understand the charges?" She said, "Yes, and I'm telling you right now, this is ridiculous." I took a breath. I've heard that sentence more times than I can count. I said, "It may feel ridiculous to you, but if the evidence shows someone was harmed, it's not ridiculous to them. Let's proceed respectfully." The prosecutor summarized the allegation. The defense attorney, polite professional, requested that the court consider her as someone with no prior record, someone who had a moment and regretted it. I watched her as he spoke, and what concerned me was that her face didn't match his words. He was offering humility. She was offering impatience. Then we addressed the video evidence. I said, "Ms. Hart, have you seen the video that the state intends to introduce?" She said, "I've seen a clip. It doesn't show what happened." I nodded. That's why we don't rely on clips, we rely on the whole picture. The video was played and I watched it carefully, not like a spectator, but like a judge. I watched Mr. Russo's body language. I watched his hands. I watched her face. He stepped forward and pointed to the sign. He didn't touch her. He didn't block her. He looked like a man doing a job he's done 1,000 times. She stepped closer. Her arm moved. The slap happened quickly, but it was clear. You could see his head turn. You could see him catch himself. I looked out at the courtroom. You could feel it, the collective discomfort, not because it was graphic, because it was disrespectful, a public act of humiliation. I turned back to her. I said, "Ms. Hart, the video shows you striking Mr. Russo." She leaned slightly back in her chair and said, "It looks worse on camera." I shook my head slowly. I said, "Ma'am, do you hear what you're saying? You're not denying you did it. You're just unhappy about how it appears." She said, "He was antagonizing me." I said, "Antagonizing you by telling you to move your car from a reserved space?" She rolled her eyes, actually rolled her eyes. I felt my patience tightening, but I didn't raise my voice. I never want a defendant to confuse volume with authority. I said, "Ms. Hart, in my courtroom, we don't roll our eyes at accountability." Her attorney put a hand up slightly, as if to calm things down. But then something happened that shifted the whole day. My bailiff approached quietly and handed something to my clerk. My clerk leaned toward me and said there had been a development, something the prosecutor wanted the court to see. I said, "Counsel, what is it?" The prosecutor said, "Judge, the state has received screenshots posted this morning. The defendant made public comments about today's proceedings." I looked at Ms. Hart. I said, "Ms. Hart, did you post about this case today?" She hesitated a half second too long. She said, "I don't know what you mean." I said, "Let's not play games. Did you post about your court appearance today?" She said, "I posted something. It's my personal account." I nodded. "It may be your account. But when you post about an active case, mocking it, you're showing this court your attitude about the process." The prosecutor asked permission to show the screenshots. I allowed it. On the screen were messages, casual, dismissive. One said something like, "This judge is so dramatic." Another, "I swear I own this courtroom." And then the one that hit me hardest, not because it insulted me, but because it revealed her character. They're acting like this is a big deal. Literally nothing. I looked at that screen. Then I looked at Mr. Russo. His eyes dropped. Not because he was weak, because he was tired of being treated like he didn't matter. I turned back to her. I said, "Ms. Hart, do you understand what those words mean to the man you struck?" She shrugged and said, "It's social media. It's not serious." I leaned forward slightly. I said, "Let me tell you something, ma'am. Social media doesn't erase reality. It documents it, and what you're documenting is a complete lack of remorse." I paused, then spoke carefully. I said, "This isn't about my feelings. I've heard worse things said about me. This is about what kind of person thinks it's funny to hurt someone and then call it nothing." Her attorney tried to redirect. He said, "Your Honor, she's under stress. She reacted poorly. She didn't mean..." I held up a hand. I said, "Counsel, I appreciate your professionalism, but I need to hear it from her." I turned to her again. I said, "Ms. Hart, look at Mr. Russo. I want you to look at him." She looked, but only for a moment. I said, "He's 69 years old. He was working. He wasn't arguing politics with you. He wasn't insulting your family. He was doing his job. And you struck him." Her voice got sharper. She said, "I didn't hit him that hard." I took a breath, composed myself. I said, "Ma'am, you don't get to decide what hard means when you're the one doing the hitting." Then I invited Mr. Russo to speak, if he wished. I said, "Mr. Russo, you don't have to say anything, but if you want to tell me how this affected you, I'll listen." He stood slowly, respectful. He said, "Judge, I've worked my whole life. I've been yelled at before, but I've never been slapped like that. I felt small, like I was nothing." That word again, nothing. He continued, "I didn't want her arrested. I just wanted her to move her car. And when she hit me, I went home and my wife saw my face. She cried. She said, 'Why do you still do that job?' And I told her, 'Because it's honest work.' That testimony broke my heart, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet way, because it reminded me how fragile dignity can be and how easily some people trample it. I looked back at Ms. Hart. I said, "Ms. Hart, do you hear him?" She swallowed. For the first time, her confidence wavered. She said softer, "I hear him." I said, "Then say what you need to say." And she hesitated again, because apology is hard when you've built your whole life on never having to give one. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry." But it came out like a transaction, not a feeling. And in my years on the bench, I've learned the difference. I've been on this bench long enough to know that a sentence has to do two things: protect the public and teach the defendant. Punishment alone doesn't reform people, and mercy without accountability doesn't either. I looked at Ms. Hart and spoke slowly, clearly. I said, "Ms. Hart, I want you to understand something." I paused. I've been a judge for 40 years. I've seen thousands of defendants. Some are remorseful. Some are scared. Some genuinely made mistakes. I looked down at the screenshots again. I said, "You posted on social media during these proceedings that I'm dramatic, that you own this courtroom, that what you did is literally nothing." I let that sit in the room. I said, "Let me tell you what's not nothing. Mr. Russo, sitting right there, is 69 years old. He's been working honest jobs for decades. He deserves to go home without bruises. He deserves to go home with dignity." Then I said something I believed my whole career. I said, "Respect isn't optional in a civilized society." And I meant it. I continued, "This sentence isn't about humiliating you. It's about teaching you what you should have learned long ago: accountability. Here's what I ordered: realistic, lawful, and designed to correct behavior. I said, I'm finding you responsible on the disorderly conduct and assault charges based on the evidence presented. On the resisting allegation, I'm taking into account the testimony and your lack of cooperation, but I'm also considering your lack of prior record." Then I laid it out. I said, "You will pay restitution for Mr. Russo's medical expenses." After I delivered the sentence, the courtroom got very quiet. That's usually when reality arrives, when the performance ends and consequences begin. Mr. Russo didn't celebrate. He didn't smirk. He just sat back down, and I could see a weight lift off his shoulders. Not because he wanted her to suffer, because he wanted to be acknowledged. Ms. Hart stood there stunned. Her face changed in stages: disbelief, then anger, then something else. Fear, not fear of me. Fear of not being able to talk her way out of life anymore. As she stepped away from the table, she finally started to cry. And people assume tears mean remorse. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they mean, "I can't believe this is happening to me." I said one last thing before adjourning. I said, "Ms. Hart, your life isn't over. But if you don't learn from this, you'll keep repeating it. And next time, it may not be a slap. It may be something worse." After court, Mr. Russo approached quietly. He thanked me, and I thanked him right back for his patience, for his dignity, for showing up and telling the truth without hatred. Later, I told my staff something I still believe. I said, "We're not here to win, we're here to correct." The clip of the hearing spread online too, people reacting to the "I own this courtroom" line, people cheering, people arguing. But for me, the real result wasn't online. The real result was that a working man walked out feeling like the system saw him. That's what I want. Every day I sit on that bench. Let me tell you what I hope people learn from this case. First, you don't own a courtroom. The law owns that courtroom. And the law belongs to everyone: rich, poor, powerful, unknown. That's the whole point. Second, social media isn't real life. Those posts where you mock consequences, where you call harm nothing, they don't make reality disappear. They just reveal your heart to the world. And finally, treat people with dignity, especially the people doing the work that keeps society running. The attendants, the clerks, the workers, the elderly. One day you'll need their patience, and you'll hope they show you more respect than you showed them. In my 40 years on the bench, I've learned this. Accountability is not cruelty, it's compassion with boundaries. And that's what justice means to me.